There is a specific kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can feel it in a room full of people who love you, at the dinner table, in the group chat, at the party you were invited to. A quiet glass wall slides down between you and everyone else, and you find yourself performing warmth you don't feel, nodding at a life that doesn't seem to be yours. You smile, you answer, and somewhere underneath it a voice says, almost gently, "I don't think I belong here." Most people who feel this assume something has gone wrong with them, that they're broken, cold, difficult, too much, not enough. Carl Jung spent his entire life arguing the opposite. He believed that for a certain kind of person, the feeling of not belonging is not a symptom of failure. It is the first sign that you have started to become yourself. And the reason you can't settle, the reason no place ever quite closes around you, is not that you haven't found where you belong, it's that you were never meant to stay. Before we go further, let's take away the easy answer. Because the easy answer is everywhere, and it doesn't survive contact with your real experience. The internet will tell you that you feel like you don't belong because you haven't found your people yet. Keep looking, it says. Somewhere out there is the tribe that finally fits. And sometimes that's true, but you already know it isn't the whole story because you have found your people more than once. You've been in the room with people who genuinely understood you, and the glass wall came down anyway. Jung saw this clearly. He wrote that loneliness does not come from having no one around you. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that feel most important to you, or from holding views that the people around you find inadmissible. Read that again. The problem was never the absence of people. It was the impossibility of being met at the depth where you actually live. That's why you can feel it most sharply in a crowd. A crowd is the loudest possible proof that the connection on offer is happening somewhere shallower than you are. You probably know the textures of it better than you'd like to. The half-second lag before you answer a simple question like, "Where are you from?" Because none of the true answers fit. The constant low effort of translation, converting what you actually think into something sayable at this table, this job, this family, and the fatigue of never quite finishing the conversion. The strange relief that washes over you when you finally leave a gathering you were dreading. The way the air in the car feels like your own again. The friendships that look complete from the outside and yet leave a thin, specific hunger untouched. None of this means you are cold or ungrateful or incapable of love. It means there is a part of you that has never once been in the room, and it is tired of pretending it doesn't exist. So this is not a video about loneliness. Loneliness is about distance from other people. What we're talking about is something stranger and more specific, a distance from the shape you were supposed to fit into, the herd, as Jung sometimes called it, not unkindly. From the moment you were born, the people around you began preparing you to fit. Family first, then friends, school, the unspoken rules of your town, your class, your generation. They handed you a mold, and the mold had real gifts inside it. Safety, belonging, an identity you didn't have to build from scratch. For most people, most of the time, the mold worked. They settle into it, and it holds them. But you didn't settle. And the modern story says that's a defect to be fixed. Jung said it might be the most important thing that ever happened to you. Here is a sentence of his that almost no one quotes because it refuses to comfort you. The development of personality, he wrote, is at once a charisma and a curse because its first result is the conscious and unavoidable separation of the single individual from the undifferentiated, unconscious herd. Sit with that. The very first thing that happens when you begin to become a real, distinct person is that you get cut loose from the crowd you used to disappear into, not as a punishment, as a consequence. The apartness you've been treating as evidence that you're failing at life is, in Jung's framework, evidence that something in you started to exist that wasn't there before. You didn't fall out of belonging. You grew out of it. And growing out of something always feels, at first, exactly like being exiled from it. Now, why does this happen to some people and not others? Jung's answer is one of his strangest and most beautiful ideas: vocation. We use that word now to mean a job, a career, a calling in the soft, motivational poster sense. Jung meant something almost frightening by it. To have a vocation, he said, is to hear the voice of the inner man, to be called. The Latin root, vocare, means to be called, and a call, by definition, calls you somewhere. It calls you away. Jung wrote that vocation acts like a law of God from which there is no escape. The person who has it must obey an inner law, even when every external voice is begging them to be reasonable, to stay, to want what everyone else wants. And here is the part the Find Your Purpose industry will never tell you, because it doesn't sell. To be called is to be called out of the herd. The voice that makes you uniquely yourself is the same voice that makes you unable to belong on the old terms. You cannot have the calling and keep the crowd. That was the price, and on some level you've already been paying it for years. But I want to be honest with you about a trap here, because most videos on this subject walk you straight into it. There is a flattering version of everything I've just said. It goes, you don't belong because you're better. You're too deep, too smart, too awake for the sheep around you. They're asleep, you see. And that story feels wonderful for about a week. Jung had a precise and unsentimental name for what's happening when you reach for it. He called it inflation. And the figure it produces, the manner personality, the ego dressing up in the robes of the wise one, the prophet, the lonely genius who alone perceives the truth. Watch what just happened. You spent years trapped inside a persona, a mask of who the group wanted you to be. And the moment that mask cracked and you felt the freedom of not belonging, you reached for a second mask, the special outsider, and put it on just as fast. You didn't become yourself. You swapped one costume for another. This is why so much of the not belonging content online quietly poisons the people it claims to help. It sells the inflation. It tells you the apartness makes you superior. Real individuation, Jung insisted, does the opposite. It is humbling. You become more ordinary and more entirely yourself at the same time. You stop needing to be the one who doesn't fit, which is the only way the not fitting ever stops hurting. Let's go deeper into the mask, because this is where the feeling actually comes from for a lot of people. The persona, in Jung's language, is the face you turn toward the world, and it's necessary. We all need one. But for years, many of us don't just wear the persona, we become it. We belong, but it's the mask that belongs. The version of you the group approved of is the version that got the invitations, held the conversations, fit the seat at the table. The real you never made contact, because contact was never on the menu. And so one day the mask cracks, maybe through a loss, a burnout, a quiet middle-of-the-night question, and suddenly you feel like a stranger in a life that used to fit. People assume the not belonging is new. It isn't. It was always there, underneath. You only felt it now because the mask finally got thin enough to feel through. That hollow ache isn't the connection breaking. It's the bill arriving for a belonging that was never real in the first place. And the cruelest irony, the one Jung pointed at again and again, the harder you push to fit, the more alien you become. He had a word for how the psyche flips into its own opposite under pressure enantiodromia. Over-identify with the mask, force the fit, perform the belonging with everything you have, and you don't dissolve the apartness, you manufacture it. Because now even your belonging excludes the one person who needed to be let in, you. So if the answer isn't to fit harder, and it isn't to crown yourself the special exile, then what is the not belonging actually for? This is the turn, and it's the part Jung spent the back half of his life on. He came to believe that the pull away from the crowd is, at its root, a refusal, the psyche's refusal to go unconscious inside a group. In his late book, The Undiscovered Self, written after he had watched entire civilized nations dissolve into mobs, he described what frictionless belonging actually costs. He called it, borrowing an old phrase, participation mystique, a state in which the individual is blotted out, absorbed into the group mind, until the crowd's lowest common impulse becomes your own morality, and you don't even notice it happened. The person who fits too well, too easily, has often paid for it with their own center. And Jung's line on the alternative is one of the hardest, truest things he ever wrote. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. Read Against Your Own Life. It says something almost unbearable and almost freeing. Sometimes the reason you can't merge into the group is that something in you is standing guard over a self that the group would have quietly erased. The not belonging is a sentry. It is the part of you that refused to be blotted out. And once you see it that way, the loneliest fact about you turns over and reveals its other face. Because Jung believed you are not, in the deepest sense, homeless at all. Underneath the social self that doesn't fit your town, there is something far older. He used to tell his patients that the two of them together were addressing the 2-million-year-old man who lives in all of us, the deep ancestral layer of the psyche he called the collective unconscious. Modern man, he said, is a foundling. You are not a misfit of your decade. You are a node of something vast and ancient, briefly wearing this era's clothes, this body, this name. And part of what you've been experiencing as not belonging here is actually a kind of homesickness, a pull toward a belonging so much deeper than the dinner table that the dinner table can't satisfy it and was never built to. The ache was never proof you have no home. It was the size of the home you're actually looking for. Jung knew all of this from the inside, which is why it doesn't read like theory when you find it in his own writing. As a child, he experienced himself as two people, a schoolboy in the 19th century, and at the very same time, a dignified old man from a much earlier age. He called them, simply, his number one and number two personalities, and the doubleness never fully left him. He wrote, looking back on his whole life, that he had to obey an inner law that was imposed on him and left him no freedom of choice. He could not stay inside Freud's circle, the warmest professional belonging of his life, because his own voice was telling him something the circle could not allow, and choosing the voice cost him the friendship, the status, and years of near isolation. In his 60s, he built a tower of stone by a lake at Bollingen with his own hands, partly so that he would have a place to live close to that ancient number two self. The most influential outsider in the history of the mind did not become influential in spite of not belonging. He became himself precisely because, again and again, he could not stay where staying would have meant disappearing. So where does this leave you tonight, with the glass walls still down and the party still going on without you? Here is the counter-truth, and it's quieter than the inflation story, but it's the only one that holds. You don't actually belong to a group. You never will, not in the way the ache keeps demanding, and the demand itself is the last piece of the mask. What Jung said you belong to is the self, the whole of who you are, conscious and unconscious, the center you've been circling your whole life. Individuation, he wrote, means fidelity to the law of one's own being, not loyalty to the crowd, and not loyalty to the flattering image of the rebel who's better than the crowd. Loyalty to the actual law of your own nature, which is yours alone to obey. And here is the paradox that turns the whole thing around. Only the person who can stand apart can truly connect. Fusion isn't connection. Fusion is two people quietly vanishing into one shapeless thing. Real meeting requires two who are genuinely separate. Jung put it like this: the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. You cannot have that reaction from inside the mold. You can only have it as yourself, standing on your own ground, finally distinct enough to actually touch another person instead of dissolving into the group around them. So stop reading the feeling as a verdict. The not belonging was never a sign that you're unlovable or cold or doomed to drift. It was the cost of becoming someone real enough to be worth meeting, and the homesickness for a belonging deeper than any room. You were never meant to stay where you'd have to disappear to fit. You were meant to come home to yourself first. And the strange thing, the thing almost nobody warns you about, is what happens after you do. The people don't necessarily change. The town doesn't change. But you stop arriving at the table as a mask begging to be let in, and you start arriving as a person, and a person, unlike a mask, can actually be met. That is when the wall finally goes quiet. Not because you found the crowd that fits you, but because you stop needing the crowd to tell you that you exist. You always belonged, just never to them. You belonged the whole time. to the self you were on your way to becoming. If something in this finally put words to a feeling you've carried for years, stay a while, there's a deeper one waiting for you next.